The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Michael Chen triple-checked his travel documents. This wasn't just any trip, it was the fulfillment of a promise he'd made to his mother years ago. 6 months of overtime and skipped lunches had finally made it possible. First-class tickets to Japan, where his mother had always dreamed of visiting the cherry blossoms that reminded her of her childhood home. "Are you ready, Mom?" Michael called out, zipping up his carry-on bag. He glanced at his watch, 3 hours before departure, perfect timing. His mother appeared in the doorway, her silver-streaked hair neatly pinned back, wearing the new blue travel outfit Michael had bought her for the occasion. Despite her smile, Michael noticed how she leaned against the doorframe, the slight wince she tried to hide. Her back pain had been getting worse lately, which was exactly why he'd splurged on first-class tickets. The wider seats and extra legroom would make the 14-hour flight bearable for her. "I still think it's too much money," she said softly, patting his cheek. "Economy would have been fine." Michael shook his head. "Not a chance. You deserve this, Mom. After everything you've done for me, this is just a small thank you." The taxi ride to O'Hare International Airport was filled with his mother's excited chatter. It was the most animated he'd seen her since before Dad died. Michael felt a warm sense of pride. This was exactly why he'd worked so hard to make this happen. The airport bustled with the usual chaos of rolling suitcases and hurried travelers. Michael guided his mother through the crowd, one hand protectively at her elbow, the other pulling their luggage. The first-class check-in line was blissfully short compared to the snaking economy queue. "Next, please," called the attendant, a woman with sharp features and perfectly manicured nails that clicked against her keyboard. Her name badge read Heather. Michael stepped forward with a smile, presenting their passports and pulling up the confirmation email on his phone. "Good morning. Chen, 2 passengers for Flight 872 to Tokyo." The attendant's eyes flicked between their passports and her screen, her expression shifting subtly. "One moment, please." Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Is everything okay?" Michael asked, a small knot of worry forming in his stomach. "I'm showing you booked in economy class, not first class," she said, without looking up. Michael blinked in confusion. "That's not right." "I specifically booked first class." He turned his phone toward her, showing the confirmation email that clearly stated first class next to both their names. The attendant barely glanced at it. "The system shows economy. Email confirmations can have errors." "But I paid for first class," Michael insisted, his voice still level but with an edge of frustration. "Can you please double-check?" People in line behind them began to shift impatiently. The attendant's eyes darted to them, then back to Michael with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, I've checked. The system shows economy. If you'd like to upgrade, that would be an additional $4,200 per person." Michael felt his mother's hand on his arm. "It's okay," she whispered. "Economy is fine." But it wasn't fine. Michael pulled up his banking app, showing the transaction amount that matched first-class tickets, not economy. "I paid for first class," he repeated, keeping his voice steady despite his rising frustration. The attendant's face hardened. "Sir, you're holding up the line. I can only go by what's in the system. If there's been an error, you'll need to take it up with customer service after your flight." Michael opened his mouth to protest again, but felt his mother's grip tighten on his arm. He looked down to see her supple headshake, the resigned look in her eyes that said, "Don't make a scene." With a heavy sigh, Michael accepted the economy boarding passes. As they moved away from the counter, he couldn't help but notice the same attendant warmly greeting the next customers in line, a middle-aged couple in golf attire, with a smile she hadn't offered to them. "It's really okay," his mother assured him as they headed toward security. "The important thing is we're going." Michael nodded, forcing a smile for her sake. But inside, disappointment and frustration churned. He'd wanted so badly to give his mother this one special experience. Now he'd have to watch her struggle through a 14-hour flight in a cramped economy seat, her back pain surely to worsen. Little did he know that this disappointing start to their journey was about to lead to something neither of them could have imagined. The economy section of the plane was packed tight, a stark contrast to the spacious first-class cabin Michael had glimpsed when boarding. He felt a pang in his chest as he helped his mother navigate the narrow aisle, watching her wince with each careful step. "Seats 34B and C," Michael said gently, pointing to their row. His heart sank further when he realized his mother would be stuck in the middle seat with a stranger by the window, a large man already spilling over into her space, headphones on and eyes closed. "Let me take the middle, Mom," Michael offered quickly. She shook her head. "No, you're too tall. Your legs need the aisle." Before he could argue, she squeezed past him and settled into the middle seat, her face briefly contorting with pain as she lowered herself down. Michael stored their bags in the overhead compartment and sat beside her, immediately feeling the lack of legroom. He glanced at his mother, who was already trying to find a comfortable position, her hands fidgeting with the seatbelt. "I'm so sorry about this," he whispered, leaning close. "Hush now," she replied with a gentle smile. "We're going to Japan. That's what matters." Across the aisle sat an older gentleman in a simple gray suit that looked expensive despite its understated style. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair neatly combed to the side. Unlike most passengers absorbed in phones or tablets, he was reading an actual paper book. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and soon after, the plane rumbled down the runway and lifted into the air. Michael's mother gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. She had always been a nervous flyer. About an hour into the flight, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Folks, we're expecting some turbulence ahead. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin, and passengers, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Almost immediately, the plane began to bounce and dip. Michael's mother closed her eyes, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The turbulence intensified, the plane dropping suddenly before rising again. "It's okay, Mom," Michael said, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "Just some air pockets, totally normal." A particularly sharp jolt made her gasp. The man by the window continued snoring, oblivious, while she pressed herself against the seat, trembling. "Would your mother like to trade places with me?" Michael looked up, surprised. The gentleman from across the aisle had leaned over, his voice gentle but clear above the noise of the plane. He had unfastened his seatbelt despite the illuminated sign. "Sir, you should stay seated during turbulence," Michael said. "I've flown this route over 300 times," the man replied with a warm smile. "This is nothing to worry about, but I can see your mother is uncomfortable. I have an aisle seat, and it might help her to be able to stretch her legs a bit." Before Michael could respond, another bout of turbulence hit, causing the drinks on the service cart to rattle. His mother whimpered softly. The gentleman stood in one smooth motion during a brief lull and gestured to his seat. "Please, I insist." Michael looked to his mother, who nodded gratefully. With some careful maneuvering and the help of a concerned flight attendant who seemed to recognize the older man, they managed the switch. Once settled in her new seat, Michael's mother visibly relaxed, able to extend her legs slightly into the aisle when no one was passing. "Thank you," Michael said to the gentleman, now seated in the cramped middle seat without complaint. "I'm Michael, and this is my mother, Lynn." "Thomas," the man replied simply, offering his hand. "Pleased to meet you both." As the turbulence continued, Thomas engaged Lynn in conversation, asking about her hometown in Taiwan and sharing stories of his own travels there. His calm, measured voice seemed to ground her, and soon she was describing her favorite childhood memories of night markets and temples, momentarily forgetting both the turbulence and her discomfort. Michael watched in amazement as his shy mother, who rarely spoke to strangers, animated by this kind man's genuine interest. Each time the plane shook, Thomas would casually point out something through the window or ask another thoughtful question, skillfully redirecting her attention. "You travel a lot?" Michael asked during a pause in their conversation. Thomas smiled. "You could say that. Work keeps me in the air more than on the ground sometimes." "What kind of work do you do?" Lynn asked. The question was innocent enough, but Michael noticed a flicker of something, amusement, caution, crossed Thomas's face before he answered. "Oh, I'm in the transportation business," he said simply. "Nothing very exciting." Little did Michael know that this understated response contained one of the biggest understatements he would ever hear. 1 year after that fateful flight, Michael stood at a podium in a crowded hotel ballroom in Singapore. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. In the front row sat his mother, beaming with pride. Beside her was Thomas, looking exactly as he had when they first met. Unassuming in his simple grey suit, but now Michael knew better than to underestimate him. "When I was bumped from first class last year," Michael began, "I never imagined it would lead me here, speaking to airline executives from around the world." The room was packed with representatives from over 50 airlines, all gathered for the International Air Transport Association's annual conference. Michael's session, Equity in the Skies, the Skyline Revolution, had drawn the largest crowd of the day. Behind him, a giant screen displayed a chart showing passenger satisfaction scores across different demographic groups. Before Skyline's new program, there had been noticeable gaps. Now, the lines converged nearly perfectly. "The changes we implemented weren't complicated," Michael continued, clicking to the next slide. "But they were thorough." He explained how they had rebuilt Skyline's training from the ground up, focusing not just on rules but on understanding. How they had changed hiring practices to build more diverse teams. How they had created new technology to flag potential bias in booking and seating algorithms. "And the results speak for themselves," Michael said, pointing to another chart. "Customer complaints down 40%. Employee satisfaction up 35%. And our profits," he paused for effect, "up 22% in just 1 year." That last figure caused a ripple of murmurs through the audience. This was a language every airline understood, the bottom line. "Turns out," Michael said with a smile, "treating everyone with dignity and respect isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business." After his presentation, airline representatives swarmed Michael, eager to learn more about Skyline's program. Thomas stood back, letting Michael handle the spotlight. This was his moment. Later, at a small celebration dinner, Thomas raised his glass to Michael, who turned a negative experience into positive change for millions of travelers. Michael shook his head, embarrassed by the attention. "I just pointed out problems that were already there." "No," Lynn said firmly, surprising everyone. His quiet mother rarely spoke up in groups. "You did what you've always done. You saw a system that wasn't working for everyone, and you fixed it." Heather, who had become one of Michael's strongest advocates after her 2-week leave, nodded in agreement. Most people would have just complained about their own experience. You looked at the whole system. Michael felt a wave of emotion as he looked around the table. The team he had built over the past year included people from all backgrounds, some airline veterans, others newcomers with fresh perspectives. Together, they had created something remarkable. "I had help," he said simply. "A lot of it." "That's the real lesson here," Thomas added. "One person can identify a problem, but it takes a community to solve it." As the evening wound down, Michael stepped out onto the hotel balcony for some fresh air. The Singapore skyline glittered before him, planes taking off and landing in the distance. He thought about how differently things might have turned out if he had kept quiet about what happened that day at check-in. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a major airline in Europe asking if he would consult on implementing Skyline's equity program for their company. Another notification followed, a message from a former colleague at his old software job. "Saw your presentation online. You're changing the world out there." Michael smiled to himself. He hadn't set out to change the world. He just wanted his mother to have a comfortable seat on her dream vacation. But sometimes the wrong seat leads you to exactly where you need to be. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find his mother joining him on the balcony. She looped her arm through his, gazing out at the city lights. "Are you happy?" she asked simply. Michael considered the question. His new job was challenging, sometimes frustrating, but deeply fulfilling. Every day, he saw the impact of his work in the faces of travelers who were treated with the dignity they deserved. "Yes," he said, "I really am." Lynn nodded, satisfied. Then everything happened just as it should. As they stood there together, Michael realized that what had begun as a story of rejection had become something much bigger. A story of transformation. Not just for him or for Skyline Airways, but potentially for an entire industry. And it had all started with being denied a seat in first class. The turbulence eventually settled, and the flight attendants began serving meals. Michael noticed that Thomas politely declined the offered tray with a simple, "No thank you, I'm fine." The flight attendant didn't insist as she might have with other passengers, but instead nodded with unusual deference. "You're not hungry?" Lynn asked, picking at her own meal of rubbery chicken and overcooked vegetables. Thomas smiled. "I usually bring my own snacks. Airline food isn't what it used to be." He reached into a small bag and pulled out a package of dried fruit and nuts, offering some to Lynn and Michael. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Thomas had a way of asking questions that made you want to answer honestly, his attention so genuine that even Lynn, normally reserved with strangers, found herself sharing stories. "So what takes you to Japan?" Thomas asked, breaking a piece of dark chocolate and sharing it with them. "It's my mother's dream trip," Michael explained. "She's wanted to see the cherry blossoms since she was a little girl." "I had a picture book," Lynn added, her eyes brightening. "My grandmother gave it to me. The photos of Kyoto in spring. I've carried those images in my head for 60 years. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The blossoms at Maruyama Park are spectacular. There's a weeping cherry tree there that's lit up at night, quite magical." "You sound like you know Japan well," Michael observed. "I've been fortunate enough to travel widely," Thomas replied. "But tell me about your work, Michael. What do you do?" Michael hesitated, used to people's eyes glazing over when he described his job. "I design software, actually. Accessibility programs to help people with disabilities use computers more easily." To his surprise, Thomas leaned forward with genuine interest. "Really? What kind of innovations are you working on?" For the next 20 minutes, Michael found himself explaining his current project, a program that translated visual elements into audio descriptions for blind users with unprecedented accuracy. "The technology has existed for years," Michael explained, growing animated, but most programs miss context. They might identify an image as woman with child, but miss that it's actually a mother teaching her daughter to ride a bike. Those details matter. Thomas asked surprisingly technical questions that revealed a deep understanding of both software development and business. Michael found himself sharing challenges he rarely discussed outside work, funding issues, corporate resistance to accessibility features, and his dream of making the internet truly accessible to everyone. "It's not just about compliance with laws," Michael said passionately. "It's about human dignity, about everyone having equal access to information." Thomas nodded slowly. "You know, accessibility is an issue in my industry too. People often focus on luxury for some while forgetting basic comfort for all." "What exactly is your industry?" Michael asked, realizing Thomas had neatly avoided specifics earlier. Before Thomas could answer, Lynn, who had been quiet for a while, gasped softly. She was looking at the safety instruction card in the seat pocket, specifically at the airline logo at the bottom. "You're Thomas Warren," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael looked between his mother and Thomas, confused. "Who?" Thomas gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "You have a good eye, Mrs. Chen." Lynn turned to their son. "Thomas Warren, the founder of Skyline Airways." She gestured around them. "This airline." Michael's jaw dropped. He'd seen the name in business articles, of course. Thomas Warren was famous for starting Skyline from scratch 20 years ago, growing it into one of the world's most successful airlines. But he was notorious for avoiding publicity. Few recent photos existed, and he rarely gave interviews. "You own this airline?" Michael asked, stunned. Thomas winced slightly. "I prefer founded. The airline belongs to its employees and shareholders now, though I do still serve as CEO." He looked genuinely uncomfortable with the recognition. "I just try to keep things running smoothly." Michael's mind raced back to the check-in counter, to the attendant who had refused to honor their first-class tickets. He was sitting next to the one person who could definitively say whether a mistake had been made. "Mr. Warren," Michael began carefully. "I don't want to be a bother, but there was a situation at check-in today." Thomas held up a hand. "Please, just Thomas." His eyes showed he already guessed what Michael was about to say. "And why don't you tell me exactly what happened before your flight?" There was something in his tone, a quiet authority, that told Michael this conversation might be more important than he could have imagined. Michael felt a knot in his stomach as he explained what had happened at check-in. He kept his voice level, sticking to the facts: the confirmation email, the payment amount, the attendant's dismissal. He didn't mention his suspicions about why they might have been bumped from first class, but something in Thomas's eyes suggested he understood the unspoken. "I see," Thomas said when Michael finished. His expression had changed, a seriousness replacing his earlier warmth. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote something down. "Thank you for telling me." The captain announced their descent into Tokyo, ending their conversation as everyone prepared for landing. Thomas seemed lost in thought, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his armrest. As the plane touched down with a gentle bump, Thomas turned to them. "Do you have a connecting flight?" "Yes," Michael replied, surprised by the question. "To Kyoto, but not for 3 hours." Thomas nodded. "Would you and your mother join me for tea in the meantime?" "I know a quiet spot in the airport." Lynn looked at Michael with raised eyebrows. Michael hesitated only briefly before accepting. "Wonderful," Thomas said, reaching for his phone as the plane taxied to the gate. "If you'll excuse me a moment." He made a brief call, speaking too quietly for Michael to hear. When they finally exited the plane, Thomas politely let other passengers go ahead while they waited for Lynn to gather her things. Michael noticed how the flight crew nodded respectfully to Thomas, confirming what he now knew about the man's identity. In the terminal, a smartly dressed woman waited at the gate, her eyes scanning the deplaning passengers until she spotted Thomas. She hurried over, speaking rapidly but discreetly into his ear. Thomas listened, his expression darkening slightly before he nodded. "This is Yume, my assistant in Tokyo," Thomas introduced her. "She'll help us bypass the main terminal crowd." Yume led them through a side door and down a series of corridors reserved for staff, eventually bringing them to a spacious private lounge. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of planes taking off and landing against a backdrop of Tokyo's skyline. "Please, make yourselves comfortable." Thomas gestured to plush seats. "Lynn, there's a special tea from Kyoto I think you might enjoy." Michael helped his mother settle into a chair, noticing how she sighed with relief at the comfortable seating after the cramped flight. An attendant appeared almost instantly with a tea service, bowing respectfully before pouring. They had barely taken their first steps when the lounge door opened again. Yume entered, followed by 2 people, a tall man in an expensive suit with a badge identifying him as Akira Tanaka, customer service director, and Michael's breath caught. The check-in attendant from Chicago, Heather, looking confused and distinctly uncomfortable. The woman's eyes widened in recognition when she saw Michael and Lynn, then grew even wider as she noticed Thomas sitting with them. All color drained from her face. "Mr. Warren, I wasn't told you would be," she began, her voice faltering. "Please, sit down," Thomas said, his tone polite but leaving no room for refusal. He didn't stand or offer his hand. "I believe you've already met Mr. Chen and his mother." Heather perched on the edge of a chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The customer service director remained standing, his expression carefully neutral. "I've asked you here," Thomas continued, looking at the attendant, "because I want to understand what happened at check-in in Chicago this morning." Heather swallowed visibly. I'm not sure what you mean, sir." Thomas's voice remained calm, but Michael detected a steel edge beneath it. Mr. Chen and his mother had confirmed first-class reservations, which they paid for in full. You placed them in economy without explanation. I'd like to know why. The woman shifted uncomfortably. The system showed them in economy class. I was following protocol. Thomas turned to the customer service director. "Akira, would you please show Ms. Heather what the reservation system actually displayed?" The director opened a tablet and placed it in front of the attendant. On screen was a booking record with both Michael and Lynn's names, clearly showing first-class seats. "This is not what I saw," Heather insisted, though less confidently. "We've checked the log of actions on this reservation," Akira said quietly. The seats were changed from first to economy class manually at 7:42 a.m. Chicago time, approximately 20 minutes before Mr. Chen approached your counter. The change was made using your employee ID. Heather looked up, tears in her eyes. I can't." But everyone in the room understood what had happened, even without her saying it. The question now was what Thomas would do about it. The silence in the room felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Thomas let it stretch for a moment, his eyes never leaving the attendant's face. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't angry but deeply disappointed. "Heather, I founded this airline 20 years ago with a simple promise: to treat every passenger with dignity and respect. Heather's eyes remained fixed on her hands. A tear dropped onto her knuckles. This isn't about a seat upgrade, Thomas continued. It's about seeing people as people. He turned to Michael. Would you be willing to share how this made you feel? Sometimes we need to hear the human impact of our actions. Michael hadn't expected to be put on the spot. He glanced at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. Well, Michael took a deep breath. The truth is, I saved for a long time to get those tickets. My mom has back problems, and I wanted her first trip to Japan to be comfortable. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The thing that bothered me most wasn't being denied the seats we paid for. It was feeling invisible. Like we weren't worth the same consideration as other passengers. Lynn reached over and squeezed her son's hand. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, Michael added quietly. But it was supposed to be a special day. Heather looked up, her face flushed with shame. I'm so sorry, she whispered. For the first time, she looked directly at Lynn. Especially to you, ma'am. I didn't think about your comfort or health. Lynn studied the woman for a moment. Why? She asked simply. It was just one word, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of similar slights. The question hung in the air, demanding truth. Heather opened her mouth, then closed it again. She straightened her shoulders slightly. I've been working the check-in counter for 7 years. When I started, I saw how some of the senior staff would redistribute certain passengers away from first class. She swallowed hard. I didn't question it. Then I started doing it too. Based on what? Thomas asked, though everyone knew the answer. Names. Appearances. She looked down again. I told myself it was about maintaining a certain image for the airline, but that was just an excuse. Akira, the customer service director, looked physically ill. This is completely against company policy. We have strict rules against discrimination of any kind. Rules aren't enough, Thomas said firmly. Culture eats policy for breakfast. If this practice has survived 7 years, we have a cultural problem. He turned back to Heather. I appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to admit our mistakes. What happens now? Michael asked. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense. That depends partly on you. What do you want to happen, Michael? Michael considered the question seriously. Part of him wanted the attendant fired on the spot, but looking at her now, truly remorseful and frightened, he felt no satisfaction in that thought. I think, he said slowly, that people should have a chance to learn and do better. He looked at Heather. But only if they really want to change. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Heather, I want you to take 2 weeks of paid leave. Use that time to reflect on your choices and whether you want to be part of rebuilding our culture. He turned to Akira. I want a full audit of our booking and check-in practices focused on potential discrimination patterns. And I want new training for all customer-facing staff within 30 days. Yes, sir, Akira replied, already typing notes on his tablet. Michael, Thomas continued, would you be willing to review our new training materials? Your perspective would be invaluable. Michael blinked in surprise. I'm not an expert in airline procedures. No, but you are an expert in making systems accessible to everyone. Isn't that what your software does? Thomas smiled. Plus, you've lived the experience we're trying to prevent. Before Michael could respond, Lynn spoke up. My son will help. He has a good heart. She looked at Heather with surprising gentleness. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn. Heather wiped her eyes. Thank you. I don't deserve your kindness. Maybe not, Lynn said matter-of-factly. But kindness isn't about deserving. It's about helping each other be better. Thomas checked his watch. I've taken enough of your time. You have a connecting flight to catch. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Akira will upgrade you to first class for the remainder of your journey, with our compliments. As they gathered their belongings, Michael noticed something had shifted in the room. The tension had dissolved, replaced by something unexpected, a sense of possibility. What had begun as a confrontation had somehow transformed into the beginning of something new. Looking at Thomas, Michael realized the airline CEO had engineered this outcome all along. This wasn't just about righting a wrong for 2 passengers. It was about seizing an opportunity to heal a deeper problem. As they walked toward their gate, Lynn looked happier than she had all day. Sometimes, she said wisely, good things come from bad beginnings. Michael nodded, wondering what other surprises this remarkable journey might hold. 3 months flew by in a blur of cherry blossoms, ancient temples, and peaceful gardens. Michael and his mother's trip to Japan had been everything they'd hoped for, and more comfortable than expected, thanks to the first-class seats Thomas had arranged for their entire journey. The incident at the airport gradually faded from Michael's thoughts as he settled back into his routine at home. His work developing accessibility software kept him busy, and the memory of that confrontation in Tokyo became just another travel story to tell friends over dinner. Until his phone rang one Tuesday afternoon. Michael Chen speaking, he answered, sandwiching the phone between his ear and shoulder as he continued typing code. Michael, it's Thomas Warren. Michael's fingers froze over his keyboard. Mr. Warren, this is unexpected. A warm chuckle came through the line. I thought we agreed on Thomas. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Of course, Michael said, pushing away from his desk. How are you? Very well, thank you. And your mother? She's great. She shows everyone her Japan photos at least twice. Michael smiled at the thought. The trip really meant a lot to her. I'm glad to hear it. There was a brief pause before Thomas continued. Michael, I'm calling because our conversation in Tokyo has stayed with me. It sparked something important at Skyline. What do you mean? After you left, I did some digging. What happened to you and your mother wasn't an isolated incident. We found patterns of similar behavior across multiple airports. Michael's stomach tightened. That's disappointing but not surprising. No, it wasn't, Thomas agreed. But here's what might surprise you. We're changing it. We've spent the last 3 months completely overhauling our training and policies, but we've hit a roadblock. What kind of blockage? Michael asked, curiosity piqued. We've got the airline perspective, but we're missing the passenger experience, especially from those who faced these barriers. Thomas paused. That's where you come in. I'd like to hire you as a consultant. Michael blinked in surprise. Me? I don't know anything about running an airline. But you know everything about making systems accessible to everyone. Isn't that exactly what we need? The offer was unexpected but intriguing. What exactly would you want me to do? Review our new training materials, help design customer service protocols, maybe even lead some workshops. Thomas's voice grew more animated. Your background in accessibility software gives you a unique perspective on inclusive design that goes beyond just physical access. Michael hesitated. I already have a full-time job. We can work around your schedule, Thomas offered quickly. And of course, we'll compensate you appropriately. Let me think about it, Michael said, mind already racing with possibilities. 2 weeks later, Michael found himself in Skyline's corporate headquarters, standing before a room of airline executives with a presentation he titled The Invisible Passenger. His slides showed how small biases in systems, from booking algorithms to check-in procedures, could create huge barriers for certain travelers. The problem isn't just individual bias, Michael explained, clicking to a diagram he'd created. It's about systems that allow those biases to affect customer experiences. The executives leaned forward, taking notes. These weren't reluctant participants forced into sensitivity training. They were engaged business leaders who recognized both the ethical and financial benefits of getting this right. After his presentation, Akira Tanaka, the customer service director from Tokyo, approached him. Your insights are exactly what we needed. Would you consider a more permanent role with us? Michael laughed. I'm a software developer, not an airline expert. But you understand people and systems, Akira insisted. And that's what this is really about. Over dinner that evening, Thomas made the offer official. We'd like to create a new position, Director of Customer Equity and Experience. The role would combine your technical expertise with what you've been helping us develop these past weeks. Michael nearly choked on his water. You want me to join Skyline full-time? Thomas nodded. Your work on accessibility software taught you how to identify and remove barriers most people never notice. That's precisely the skill we need. But my current job pays half what we're offering, Thomas said with a small smile. And I suspect gives you half the impact. Here, you could help millions of travelers. Michael thought about his mother's face when she'd been denied her first-class seat. Then he thought about how many others had similar experiences that no one ever addressed. "I need to think about it," he said carefully. "This would be a big change." "Of course," Thomas agreed. "Take all the time you need." Back in his hotel room, Michael called his mother. After explaining the surprising offer, he asked, "What do you think, Mom?" "Am I crazy to even consider this?" Lynn was quiet for a moment. "Remember when you were little and that boy kept pushing you off the swings at the park?" "Tommy Woo?" Michael smiled at the random memory. "Sure. You didn't just learn to swing when he wasn't around. You taught all the smaller children how to stand up to him too." Her voice softened. "You've always fixed systems, not just problems. Maybe this is where you're meant to be." As Michael hung up, he realized his mother was right. His accessibility software helped individuals, but at Skyline, he could change an entire industry. The next morning, he walked into Thomas's office with his decision. "I'm in," he said simply, "but I have some conditions." Thomas smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything less."